While everyone's getting pizza, I thought I would at least start out with introductions. My name's Lorraine Terrell. I'm the Director of Public Relations for the School of Arts and Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you today for our Knowledge by the Slice talk. The Knowledge by the Slice series is sponsored by the School of Arts and Sciences. Our goal with this program is to give the broader campus community an opportunity to hear about some of the great work that our faculty experts are doing. People who might not be in a position to sign up for classes still get to meet some of our great faculty this way. Today we're featuring Professor Annette Lareau. Dr. Lareau is the Stanley I. Sheerr Term Professor in the Social Sciences and a Professor of Sociology. The title of her talk today, I guess this comes from the title of your book?
This will be a second edition.
Okay, Unequal Childhoods and Unequal Adulthoods. I think given the attention that's recently being paid to inequality, economic justice issues in our culture, I think this is an especially timely topic for us. Professor Lareau has done detailed research on how social structures shape individual lives. In addition to her research, she teaches introductory sociology, courses on the sociology of inequality, and courses on sociology methods to both graduate students and undergraduates. Following Professor Lareau's talk, there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A, so pay attention, prepare some questions for yourself, enjoy the pizza and the talk. And we'll look forward to welcoming people back for next semester's Knowledge by the Slice series beginning in January. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Professor Lareau.
Thank you very much to Lorraine and to Juliana Walker, who organized the events. Thanks to you for coming out. I know it's a really busy time of year. There are plenty of seats up in front, so you shouldn't be shy about if you're getting your pizza coming up. It's more comfortable to sit than to stand. So in America, there is a resistance to the study of social class in America. We have certainly a language for racial inequality in America. And in the last few weeks, there's been more attention to inequality with the debates about the 1% and the 99%. But really, most Americans consider themselves to be middle class. And there is a very strong belief in individualism. There's a very strong, so if you ask Penn undergraduates, do you think you can begin poor and end up rich? Most people will say yes. Do you think that you've gotten there as a result of your hard work? Most people will say yes. And so the role that social class differences in parenting and family life can make a difference are generally not explored in the same way that we would like. Today, there will be babies born at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, and we know that based on the social class position of their parents, those babies have different life chances. The babies of mothers who have a college degree or an advanced degree are much more likely to go to college and end up in professional jobs than the babies of mothers who are high school dropouts or high school graduates. And so my talk today is an effort to bring attention to this field of social inequality. In the study of sociology, I'm particularly interested in education and the impact of social class on education. And we know, for example, that children's SAT scores do vary by parents' social class, particularly mothers' education. And we also know it makes a difference in how many years of schooling children have, which we call educational attainment. But the mechanisms are less clear about why and how social class makes a difference. Some people say, well, it makes a difference if you ask kids about school, if you help with homework, if you attend parent-teacher conferences, if you have rules about how much TV you can watch. But the mechanisms have not been as well developed. And so in my comments today, I'm going to tell you about a study I did. I did it when the children were 10 years old, and then I followed them up 10 years later when they were 19 or 20. Now today, the young people are now about 26 years old, so it's been an ongoing process. Just in terms of sociology, in case there are sociology students in there, which is a great major, by the way, sociology. Sociologists, many people think, well, if class makes a difference, why does class make a difference? And some people really look at economic factors. Their parents could pay for college tuition. Parents could hire tutors. But in addition, in my work, I want us to pay attention to cultural dimensions, people's knowledge of institutions, people's what we call dispositions, their language use, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and their leisure activities. And the argument is that is like straw into gold. Cultural capital, cultural resources, when invested in particular ways, can yield outcomes or profits. And that's the notion of cultural capital. The idea comes from the late sociologist Pierre Bourdieu from France. And so in my argument, just to preview my argument, I found that I did a study, as I'll tell you about in a minute, of white and African American children in a large northeastern city and the suburbs. And there were 88 families that we studied, and I had research assistants who helped me. But in addition, and they were middle class, working class, and poor. And all the parents wanted their children to be healthy and to be happy and to grow and thrive. But they had different ideas about what the best way was to bring that about. And middle class parents, parents who had a college degree and worked in a professional job, saw their children as a project. And it's a gardening analogy, but originally it was going to be hothouse flower, but that seemed too judgmental. So that the idea is that there's concerted cultivation, so that parents believe that their children, that they have an obligation to foster the development of the children's talents and skills. And this contrasts with the working class and poor families, where parents used very scarce resources to get their kids to school, to dress them, to clothe them, to get them on the bus, to do the laundry. But then they presumed that really the children would spontaneously grow and thrive. And so in the book I explain, I was one time where I was visiting the homes. We visited them usually every day for 3 weeks. I was visiting the home of a girl, Katie Brindle, a white young girl. Her mother was a high school dropout. And she found a box in the dumpster, and she had the box on her head. And she said, "Mom, you want to help me do a dollhouse?" And her mom said, "Nah." And that was the end. But in the middle class homes, kids would say, "Will you help me do this?" The parents would stop what they were doing. The parents would answer questions with questions. The parents felt that they had a duty to entertain their children and to help their children grow and develop and be occupied in a way that the parents thought was a productive way. So the broader study included 88 children. The most unusual feature of it was that there were 12 children where we visited them every day, usually for 3 weeks. This was a long time ago now. This was in 93, 94. I paid them at that time $350. I had a grant from the Spencer Foundation. If I was to do it today, I would probably pay them $1,000. But still, some people declined. We started in a large northeastern school district in an urban school that was predominantly white. It was about a majority white, but it was about 3/4 poor. And so it was, but it was really almost about half black. And so there were a lot of poor white kids there too. And I visited the school starting around the fall, and I went all the way till the spring. I brought cookies for Valentine's Day. And I got to know the kids, and then from that, we did the interviews. Now, all the kids couldn't come from that school, and then there was a suburban school that would be sort of like Ballackinwood if you live around here. The city school would be sort of like the Northeast, but it was near a black urban housing project. So given that what we were asking, including that we were asking for an overnight visit, the project was very intrusive. We worked in teams of 3. One person went 3 or 4 times a week. One person went once or twice a week, and I went once or twice a week unless I was the lead field worker, which I was on 2 families, the white middle-class Tallinger family and the poor white Brindle family. There's no question that being in their living rooms, we had an impact. We noticed that yelling went up on the 3rd day and on the 10th day, and cursing went up. There's often quite a lot of yelling in families. And many of the houses were quite small, and so you could hear every word within the house. And many of the living rooms, for example, would go from, say, that wall to here. They were, 10, 12 feet across, 8 feet wide. They were small. And so we tried to be like the kids. So, like in some of the working class homes, there would be a love seat and a chair, and we would sit on the floor with the kids. We would try to sit in the back seat we tried to do what the kids did. The kids would often tell us in great detail how we changed being there. We did exit interview with the kids, and they said, well, my mom talked more, the house was cleaner, but often they said that they had been their normal selves. We did carry tape recorders with us, and then if I wasn't in the field, the research assistant spoke with me after every visit. And usually we would spend about 5 to 12 hours writing up the field notes after every visit. Okay. So then I sent a Christmas card to the young people. Every Christmas I'm getting ready to send a Christmas card again this year, though the study's over and I have no plans to continue the study. I was able to reach all 12 children, all who were now 19 or 20. If they had gone to college, and most had not, they would have been at the end of their freshman year in college when I interviewed most of them. I gave them an honorarium of $75. I did a separate interview with the mother, father, and the sibling. A few people declined, including the parents of Alexander Williams, an African-American professional family, but I interviewed Alex himself. As I explained in the second edition of the book, which just came out this fall, some of the families were fine about the portrayal, but I did give a copy of the book to the families, and some of the families were hurt by my portrayal of them. They felt that I made them look bad. One woman said, I couldn't believe the way you described our house, or the book hurt their feelings. And I think this turns out to be something that turns out to be very common when people do research. Most people don't go back and find out how people think about it. But if they do go back, it's a pretty common pattern, which raises complicated questions for research ethics. In the medical field, of course, people can be seriously harmed and die from research. And so thank goodness in the social sciences we don't face that challenge. Most of the kids remembered me. They had some hazy memory of me. They said, I remember you were there when I was washing dishes. I remember when you came to my game, things like that. Okay. So I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about the follow-up, but I just want to briefly give an overview of the major results of the original study. And the study found that children had very different ways that they spent their time when they were 9 and 10 years old. This is Garrett Tallinger's schedule when he was in 4th grade. It's just his schedule. It's not his brother's schedule or his younger brother's schedule. It's not his father or her mother's travel schedule. It's a little bit of a busy time of year because it was May and baseball was ending and soccer and swim was beginning. Excuse me, soccer was ending and baseball was beginning. But this was a pretty typical schedule for middle-class kids. And I was interviewing in a suburban school that was predominantly white, about 10% black, and then we got other blacks through a snowball sample. And I started asking every single person I knew. I went through every child in the 3rd and the 4th grade in this suburban school, which was over 100 children. And I couldn't find a middle-class child who did not have any organized activities in 4th grade. And many parents will tell me, oh, we set limits. You know, we don't do hockey. They say, Mr. Tallinger said, oh, the hockey people, they're crazy, you know. They have to get out on the ice rink and they have to drive and blah, blah, blah. But what was interesting is that the children, like I went with Garrett to the Festival of the Arts, where it was a spring performance. And it was sort of sandwiched in other activities. And the middle-class kids often looked bored at these events. And sometimes they were enjoying them, but they had on white tops and black pants, and they just kind of were on stage looking bored. And when the working class and poor kids had a very comparable spring performance, they were the same age, but the kids looked more excited. They were like smiling and bouncing up and down. One of them was like, hi, Mom. They just seemed younger at that moment. Following up on this research with a colleague, Elliot Weiniger, we did some analysis of the panel study of income dynamics, which is a national representative sample. And we did find confirmation of this pattern that as mothers' education increases, the time that children spend in organized activities also increase. So that a mother who has a graduate degree and she has 2 children, she's spending her children are spending 13 hours a week in organized activities. So it's a lot of work for parents in particular. The working class and poor kids watched TV, hung out with their cousins, played in the street, went outside. They had the sort of lives that many of the parents of the middle class children had had when they were young. But they did not, if they had organized activities, and a few did, the parents didn't see them as moments of intellectual development or moments of skill development. So many middle-class parents told me, I don't want him to be Mozart, but I want him to be exposed to music, right? I want her to find out what she likes. So middle-class parents had this notion of development of their children's talents and skills, and many kids started to specialize. It turned out by 4th grade, it was too late to get into baseball if you hadn't started. If you had started only when you were 10 years old in baseball, you were in trouble, because kids had been doing it since they'd been 3 or 4, and the skill gap was really very significant at that point. The book also talks about language use. Middle-class parents answered questions with questions. They reasoned with children extensively. There was quite a lot of talk in the house. And children sometimes would be rude to their parents, and middle-class parents didn't exactly love this, but they put up with this, thinking that they were tired, it was a hard day. The working class and poor parents, they spoke less. It was a comfortable silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but there was just less talk. So for example, in Harold McAllister, a black poor family, there was one bathroom, there were 4 family members and then another 2 or 3 cousins who were often staying there, and often sometimes another couple of adults. And so the bathroom had to be coordinated, and Ms. McAllister had a washcloth, and she would walk up to a child, she would give the child a washcloth, and she would say one word, bathroom. The child would get up, not say anything, go over and take a shower. We virtually never saw working class and poor children argue back with their parents. We didn't see whining. Middle class kids were complaining that they were bored. For example, on Christmas Eve, I was visiting with the Hanlon family, and she had been a very elaborate pageant. She'd been one of the 3 kings. They had had a pizza party before. They had cookies and ice cream later. It was snowing. Her cousins were over. In the middle of this, she flounces into the kitchen and says, "Mom, I'm bored." And the idea was that mom was supposed to do something about that. And that expectation was something we found in many middle-class families that was simply absent in the working class and poor families, black and white. We also found it in the black and white middle-class families. And the third way that class made a difference was in terms of intervention in institutions, and I'm going to talk more about that as I talk about going into college. But the working class parents and poor parents, by definition, did not have college degrees. They were high school dropouts or high school graduates. So to them, if I had to have brain surgery, God forbid, I would not supervise the brain surgeon, right? I would not say, are you going to do it this way, right? But middle-class parents had a college degree. Some of them were former teachers. They had former teachers in their networks, and they frequently supervised teachers. They criticized teachers. They asked the teachers for more homework. They asked the teachers to challenge their children in different ways. And so there was a notion that they were equals. While for working class and poor parents, they were looking up. So they saw the education in the hands of the teachers. They didn't see that parent involvement would make a difference in their educational outcomes because, after all, they weren't educated people, and it was up to the teachers to educate their children. This view did not comply with the vision of educators. The educators were seeking very active parent involvement, though truthfully, they were seeking deference. They really weren't seeking involvement. Teachers praised parents who praised them. These children were being raised in a racially segregated society. They lived in racially segregated neighborhoods. They went to racially segregated churches. Their fathers complained particularly of insults in public space, as many other sociologists have shown, and also of employment discrimination. So it's not as if race didn't make an impact. It did make an impact. But in what I was studying, particularly when the children were 10 years old, there was a lot of similarity between the black and white middle-class children, and there was a huge gap between the black middle-class children and the black working class and poor children. Now, in many aspects of daily life, there were food shortages in the poor family homes, white and black, which were difficult, but very common today with rising unemployment. But in these things, the impact of parents' economic resources didn't seem to make a difference. It seemed like the middle class were on one hand, and the working class and poor families were on the other. Now, as children aged, the impact of race became more salient, as all the research would suggest. And as I'll explain, Alexander Williams, who was in an Ivy League school, sometimes said he was followed around stores because they were afraid that he might steal things. But the white, poor, and working class young men also claimed vociferously, complained about harassment by the police. in this large northeastern city, which is also consistent with what we see in news reports. So it was really the white middle-class men who were protected in a way that nobody else was. Okay. All right. So as children aged, there were class differences in how parents supervised their lives. And it was hard to assess the language use in interviews. I wasn't doing participant observation. By the time they were in high school, they were in 10 different high schools, and it would have been challenging to go to all of them and get their SAT scores and follow them around, though that would have really been the best thing to do. So instead, I had interviews, but the results are reasonably consistent. And what you really found was that middle-class parents had a very proactive way of supervising their children's schooling, and they worked to untie knots, foresee and forestall problems, even little problems, and they tried to enhance their children's experiences. And all of these were very important, particularly in the college application process. Now, in this labor market, college really matters. The gap between the salary of college degrees and high school dropouts has really changed a lot, and it's very hard to apply for many high-quality jobs without a college degree. So here's Garrett Tallinger, a white middle-class boy. His parents graduated from a school similar to Duke or similar to Penn. They both were professionals. And when he went to school, they ended up moving 1,000 miles for his job, Mr. Tallinger's job. And right away, Mrs. Tallinger visited the high school and asked a lot of pointed questions. And in addition, they focused quite heavily on his schooling. And so Mrs. Tallinger went down to the high school, and it turned out that AP English and AP Calculus were scheduled at the same time. And she's like, come on, you've got to get this together, right? Other people are in this situation. So she also told the counselor that she thought that her son was capable of doing honors, and that she would like to see him in the most challenging courses because she knew that elite colleges looked at the transcript and what he could have taken. And this supervision didn't just happen in children's academic field, it also happened in athletics. Garrett had been a very talented soccer player when he was young. They moved 1,000 miles away, they had soccer, but basketball was more popular. Mr. Tallinger thought the people who ran soccer were knuckleheads, and gradually soccer faded and basketball took center stage. And he was supervising it. And so he said, Mr. Tallinger looked very closely, they sent a packet, he wanted to make sure that the other colleges who were recruiting him thought he was interested in them, and he was using his networks to find out about it. But more importantly, the middle-class parents were highly critical of their children. The working-class parents and the poor parents, almost none of them tried to go to college, but if they did try to go to college, the parents were like, go to college, go to the suburbs, you can do it. It was sort of this uncritical assessment. You're smart, you can do it. They weren't really involved in it. But here, Mr. Tallinger and Garrett's SAT scores were just shy of 1,200. He really wanted to go to Stanford, but Garrett himself had a lot of information. He said, I was really worried because I was trying to get into Stanford, and 1190, man, they did accept a kid with 1140, but that's why I wanted 1,200 really bad. And he could have gone to Penn, a place like Penn or Yale or Princeton, but they wouldn't have gotten any financial aid. And they had 3 kids. And so in the end, he went to a school that's similar to Villanova, partly because it was a better basketball school, but also because Mr. and Mrs. Tallinger said they couldn't afford the gap for 3 children. But when they looked at it, Mr. Tallinger was highly critical. He said, Garrett's a smart kid, he said, but he's, quote, not a brilliant kid. And he thought that he would do better at Villanova, where he would shine and stand out, than at a place like Princeton or Yale. he said, for example, I think UConn would have been a stretch ability-wise for Garrett, but they were recruiting him. And he said, look, we're not interested in that. We were interested, now we're not interested, and so you move on. Similarly, after college, he said, well, realistically, if it went very well for him, he'd probably try to make an MBA, but I'm not sure he's good enough to play in the NBA. I mean, hopefully he'll get better. He'll probably try to be one of those guys that drafted by the NBA but gets a free agent and ends up playing in Europe, which is exactly what happened. And now Garrett is in marketing, he has a business suit, and he's on the web and in sales. And so the parents also had input on his major. He was in the business school, he was thinking about becoming a teacher, and Mrs. Tallinger reported he was thinking he wanted to be a math teacher. And we said, okay, fine. Don, of course, being more pragmatic, said, if that's all you want to earn for the rest of your life as a teacher, but give yourself the most options when you come out. So then he came to his own decision, they say, and he stayed in the business school. So the parents had impact on many different aspects of his life trajectory. Wendy Driver is a white young woman whose mother is a high school graduate, whose stepfather works as a janitor in a unionized job, whose father is deceased. And when she was in 4th grade, she wasn't reading. And the mother, all the teachers reported the mother was very helpful, but she wasn't really involved in any kind of systematic way. And the mother's knowledge of her learning was very vague. And the mother said, well, they just haven't put their finger on it. It turned out she was grade level in math, but pre-literate in reading, which was an unusual combination in special education. In the end, she applied to high school. She didn't get into a high school she wanted to go to, and her pop-pop, her father's father, paid for Catholic tuition. And I went to her high school graduation party, and she was planning to go to college, but in the end, she didn't go. But what's striking is that the parents intervened early and often on things that they thought were important. So she was supposed to go to college in June. She didn't go to college. Her boyfriend, who was in the Navy, was planning to propose, and then they had an unplanned pregnancy. And the mother said, we don't believe in abortion. There's no issue about giving up the baby. If it came down to it, me and Mac would have taken it. But notice that Mrs. Driver has a very frank conversation with her future son-in-law. The mom says, I'm not one to hide my feelings. And I said to Ryan, we were sitting on the couch, I want to ask you, the first thing a lot of guys says is not mine, and they take off and you never see them again. And I said, don't. If you have any doubt in your mind that this child is not yours, then there's the door. You can walk out now. So here, this is a mother who's trying to foresee and forestall disaster. She's being very forthright. She's intervening in a very powerful way. The parents also, Wendy didn't know how to drive, so her stepfather they had moved about 2.5 hours away, and he would drive up and get her and bring her back with the baby, and he would do this a couple of times a month rather than have her take the train or the bus. They also contributed $5,000 for the wedding, which was more than Wendy wanted them to. So in many different ways, they sought to promote their daughter's success. But in terms of relations with institutions, such as schools, they had a very different relationship. And this included Wendy. So for example, while Garrett knew exactly his SAT scores and knew the SAT scores of a kid who was accepted at Stanford, nobody could report her SAT scores. Neither Wendy, her mother, or her father, though this was only 9 months after she had applied and been accepted to college. And similarly, her learning disability, I said, did you ever learn the name? I said, did you ever learn the name of what the disability was? She said, no, they call it LD. I said, do you know what LD stands for? Learning disability. And then she said, finally, I got my nerve to tell my good friends, look, I'm retarded, I can't do this. Retarded is a word that's virtually never used by professionals. So professors have people who have learning disabilities, and they come in and they often say in very specific ways what their disability is. ADHD, they have auditory sensory problems, etc. And this was not the level of detail that the working class parents had. Similarly, they had applied to a college, they had been there 2 or 3 times, and the drivers couldn't remember the name of the college. They didn't know the tuition, they didn't know how much financial aid she was getting, and what they knew was how much they would have to pay, which was going to be $1,000 a month, and she was going to get a second job. So the mother says she got accepted up in Spring Reading. I can't think of the name of the college. said, Reading up in Reading. She remembered the name of the town. But she also didn't know the season for college education. She said it was really shocking because of the interview. The person we met with was very nice. This is in the fall. And she looked at her grades and SAT and all that stuff. And when we left, they said, well, we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of months at the reception. We were ecstatic. Having thought that Wendy had been accepted, Mrs. Driver said, we went down to the front desk, and they said, we'll be calling you. And I said, what do you mean you'll be calling me? And they said, well, we'll give you a call or a letter to let you know if you're accepted. And I'm like, she's accepted. And they're like, what? And I said, they said she was accepted. And they said, that's not a promise. Mr. Driver did not know that if you didn't get into a college, he thought you would get your money back when you apply. So there was, and other parents also reported this. I interviewed this one young man who had gone to a for-profit college on computers, he said. He had gotten a $5,000 loan, which he had defaulted on, and they had come to his inner city high school to recruit him. And he said he had a master's degree. And so parents, I mean, we have a very, Penn is Ivy League, they're small liberal arts colleges, they're four-year state colleges, they're community colleges, they're for-profit colleges. This is a lot of informal knowledge, and that knowledge is hard to come by. When you apply to a college, there's a fit. You have to apply to where you're going to get in, and that's also informal knowledge, or else a counselor has to tell you. And so she applied to go to a community college, and she went to the community college, and I think what happened is that she took the test, and she didn't pass it. So she was going to have to take a non-credit course. And she said, I wanted to go to class to get credit. And they said, no, they wouldn't let me do it. If I paid for Learning Disabled program, I could do it. I tried to talk to the guy. I don't want to take it, and they didn't want to hear it. And she said, they wanted me to be with a bunch of kids with ADHD who were bad. And I'm not bad, I'm a good student. I have a learning disability. I can't read or write. I can write, I can't spell. And so she at Alverna, this Catholic college where she was going to go, I would have been in a regular class, I would have been a note taker, I would have had testing accommodation for a 3-hour test, I would have 6 hours, the teacher was going to read her the test. I asked her if she considered having her parents call or go down there, and she bristled visibly. And she said, I was old enough to make my own decisions. I knew what was wrong with me. My parents could have gone down, and basically they would have told them the same thing. I didn't want that. I was 18. I was old enough to make my own decisions. And other working class and poor parents reported the same thing. They said their kids were grown when they were 16 or 17. Harold McAllister, a kid from a poor black family, loved his mom, would do anything from her, moved frequently in high school, really wanted to be on the basketball team in the worst possible way, and was a good basketball player. In the city he was in, there was a ranking for people that was different than the ranking in schools. And he had some run-in with the coach, which I don't fully understand, but he wasn't put on the basketball team. He said the coach wanted him to play football, and he was built like a football guy, big shoulders, big guy. And he wasn't put on the basketball team. He had the grades to be on the basketball team. He talked to the principal. Principal said, talk to the coach. Coach said, you got to play football. Talked to the principal. Principal said, talk to the coach. Talked to his dad and wanted to go to another high school, knew the name of the high school, needed his dad permission to change. His dad said, just stay there. Stay there. He was so distraught by this, he said he got a job as a busboy to get his mind off of basketball. He got a waiter in a restaurant similar to TGIF, which he had to take 4 buses and took 2 hours to get to. And he usually got a ride home. And then gradually he was working the 4 to 12 shift. He got a job as a waiter. And his mom would always wake him up to go to school, but his dad didn't wake him up, and he started trailing off going to school. And in Easter, before graduation, he dropped out. And so there were instances of interventions that kids needed help with their parents. They needed help from their parents to do. So then Stacy Marshall, a black middle class girl, never been very good at math. The summer before her freshman year, her mother had her take an algebra course just to give her a little boost. She went to elaborate summer camps on math and science. They had a very elaborate college search. Again, Stacy desperately, she said she was pre-med, she desperately wanted to go to Yale, and when I interviewed her about it, she said she was still bitter, quote unquote, about it. Her mother privately worried about her ability to be pre-med. She got a C in biology her freshman year. And this is not good if you want to be pre-med. And her mother started to coach her and say, look, you've got to get out of calculus. She said, it'll bring down your GPA, you'll be traveling with the basketball team. And so she also contacted her coach for her, she helped her with her course selection. So after she had to get out of calculus, her mother's talking to her, and she's looking at it, and she emailed me first, and then she called me one night, it was 11 o'clock. And she said, well, I can take a cinema course. And I'm like, Stacy, do you know anything about it? Do they give you a description? She says, well, no, but she was on the computer. She could see there were seats in it. The time was right. And I say, sometimes you can be jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. This course may have an interesting name, but you'll be watching movies, but you'll probably be writing about them. And you have all these other courses where you'll be writing. And you tell me you don't like to write. And she's like, well, I don't know. I guess I can see your point. Mothers help children arrange for community colleges to take a class in the summer. Mothers gathered information for children. Mothers helped with passports and other internships. Mothers and fathers did many interventions in the lives of middle-class children, even after they were in college. And so in doing that, they were trying to untie knots and forestall problems and also enrich the capabilities that their young people had to deal with these issues. So that all the parents wanted their children to succeed, but the class made a difference in the strategies parents adopted to help their children. So middle-class parents not only worked with institutions directly, but they taught their children about how to work with institutions. So Mrs. Marshall said, you need to go see your academic advisor. There's a young woman who didn't appear in the book, but she was the only one who really, really tried hard to go to college, who was working class or poor. And she applied to like 6 or 7 colleges, but her combined SAT scores were 690, which is a very typical SAT score for an inner city high school student. And those are the ones who take the SAT. And she applied to all these colleges, but she applied to colleges that were 200 and 300 points above her college. And also, her mother had a car, but she was taken to the colleges by the high school counselor. She only had one recommendation. She asked the teacher for it, but it never happened. And she didn't get in anywhere. And her mother saw all the rejection letters, and the mother said, go to somewhere in the suburbs, go to a good place, don't go to the community college. So the mother was very enthusiastic, but the mother did not help her maneuver through these complex educational challenges that her daughter faced. This is a nationally representative sample. And the numbers at the top here are 86%. These are high school sophomores whose parents have a college degree. And 46%, these are, do you aspire to go to college, whose parents have a high school diploma. So 86% of the parents who have a college degree, 46% of their parents, one parent has a high school diploma. But then, are you minimally prepared? Did you take math or English that you have to take for college? It drops from 86 to 79 for the middle class kids, which we're going to call, but 46 to 33 for the working class kids. Did you take the SAT? Again, just hardly any drop, 79 to 78 if you're middle class, but from 33 to 29 if your parents have a college degree, which we're going to call working class. Did you actually apply to a four-year institution? It goes from 78 to 73. For the middle class, it goes from 29 to 25. And did you actually enroll in an institution, four-year institution, at 65%, about 2/3 of middle class kids, but only a fifth, 21% of the working class kids. So there's something happening in that process. One result of this is that the working class and poor parents had more heartache. They had hopes and dreams for their children, and they were sometimes disappointed. So Mr. Yanelli, when his son dropped out of high school, and I had been in their kitchen on a Sunday afternoon when he was 10 years old, and he said, he's going to go to college, like a college like University of Maryland. But then he never really went to high school. He spent a lot of time in the lunchroom,
and in the end, he dropped out. And Mr. Yanelli said, "It broke my heart. You know, I wasn't expecting that. I tried real hard to push him through, but it didn't happen. You know, tried to get him homework, couldn't do that. I felt bad, but that's just the way it happened. What are you going to do?" And Mr. Yanelli was deeply touched that his son did, in the end, get a GED. And he said, you know, I wanted him to go to college, but he got a GED, and he got a tear in his eye as he described. He was very proud of him that he got a GED. He got a diploma, he said. So for Mr. Yanelli, there wasn't a huge difference in his mind between a diploma from a four-year college and a GED diploma. They were both diplomas. So his knowledge of the educational system was more truncated. Mrs. McAllister said, "When Harold didn't graduate, I was mad. All he had to do was graduate. 2 months, April, May, June. And he was working. Harold's been working since he was like 15 years old at the same job. So I believe he was more interested in working than in going to school at the same time." Miss Taylor had pushed her son to go to college. She herself wasn't going to the for-profit college, University of Phoenix. But she said, and Tyrek said he was supposed to go to college. He told me, he said, I was supposed to go to college, but he'd never taken the SAT, he had never applied to a four-year college. And so I asked her, I said, "And how'd you feel?" He went to a community college, she said, to please his mother, and then never went back. She said, "Disappointed, you know, as a mother would be. You know, you feel helpless because you can't really make them. You just can't do it. They have to do it on their own." Mrs. Driver, who desperately wanted her daughter to go to college, said, "I was hurt. I wanted my child to go to college. But if you push them too hard, they won't. They won't. If I would have made her go and made her go up to that, it wouldn't have worked. And I didn't want to lose my daughter. I was afraid if I pushed her too hard, I would have lost her. She graduated from high school. She has a good head on her shoulders, and she can get somewhere in life." There was one family, a middle-class family, the Hanlon family. The daughter had a learning disability. She applied and got into a four-year college. In the end, she went to a community college, didn't like it, and ended up doing cosmetology, cutting hair. Mrs. Hanlon was visibly embarrassed that her daughter hadn't gone to college. And she said, I said, "How did you feel?" "Disappointed with her. You know, she's got to start making the decisions, but I was disappointed." But it's not simply that the parents who were disappointed. The youth themselves also were aware of their position in life, and other sociologists have argued that when people don't succeed in life, they believe that the schools are fair and that they believe that they did something wrong. They blame themselves. And so Billy Yanelli said, "I have a friend who grew up here that lived here and then moved up to a suburb. And he's a whole different person now he moved up there. He's going to college, he dressed different, he's nicer than the people who live around here. And if he lived here, he wouldn't have made it through high school. Because I went to high school with him at Lower Richmond, and he was going nowhere. He was in the lunchroom with me every day. As soon as he moved, he changed." So this idea that he's nicer than the people who live around here, that somehow middle-class people are better than working-class people. And one of the issues that came with the book, when I gave the book to people, Ms. Yanelli said, she said, "You describe other people drinking a glass of wine and we had a glass of beer," and she said, "That sounds classier, that sounds nicer," having that. And so she felt that she'd been humiliated in the book by descriptions made it seem like they were inadequate. So were there areas of race? Absolutely. All the kids had disappointments. Garrett Tallinger had his heart broken by a girl when he was in high school. Melanie Hanlon, who was middle class, had a girl die in a car accident. People had grandparents die. They had challenges. They had bumps in the road. So nobody gets through life without having bumps in the road. All of us have bumps in the road. But the working class and poor children and the middle class children had different sets of resources which they brought when they faced those challenges. Survey research often tries to look in a standardized way at the benefits that class provides. But to do that, they have to study the same thing across the whole population. And what I'm trying to suggest is that the way that class really mattered were in these little teeny ways that were preventing problems from becoming bigger. So they were forestalling problems. They were enriching kids' activities. And so at the end, Garrett Tallinger felt that he worked really hard to get to college. Stacy Marshall, Alexander Williams felt they worked really hard. Alexander Williams got accepted to an Ivy League program and an institute program to become a doctor, and now he is a doctor. Stacy Marshall ended up bailing out of the pre-med, and she got a doctoral degree in the humanities. So kids had these huge accomplishments, but it was invisible to them the role that their parents had played as these guardian angels in supervising and intervening in their lives in multiple ways. And when the working class and poor kids were older, the difference in their parents' resources mattered. For example, if they could help them buy a car, they had to pay rent at home. The poor kids started working as Harold did when they were 15, and often gave money to their parents. Harold gave money to his mom whenever she needed it, which is usually a couple times a month, maybe $80 a month, varied. So the middle class kids were hoping to travel. They talked to their parents on the phone all the time. They seemed younger. The working class kids were still hopeful, but they had car payments. Some of them had kids. They'd been working for 5 years full time, while the middle class kids had very limited work experience. So they seemed older. So the pattern that had happened when they were younger had now been reversed. In the interviews, I couldn't really even ask the same questions of the young people, because for the middle class kids who had done this elaborate college search, I would sometimes spend, there were a lot of questions. Did they take the SAT? Did they have a SAT tutor? Did they take it multiple times? How did they decide on the college? Did they go on the college search? What was their information? I could take 45 minutes to an hour just on the college process. The working class and poor kids had dropped out of high school. I could talk about that, but I couldn't talk about college because many of them didn't even know anyone who had been to college. Bill Unelli did not know anyone who had been to college. He'd been to college parties, but he didn't have any of his friends who were in college. And so their lives had diverged in a very profound way. Now, both the white and the black working class and poor young men did report regular harassment by the police. They described a white guy from a poor family required just sitting outside on the stoop and the police coming up and throwing him against a wall and searching him. They all said they didn't like the police. The white and black working class and poor young men. The black middle class young men, I don't have very many, also reported this kind of difficulty. And he said he goes around stores, he said I try not to let it bother them, but he says he noticed he'll look for the video camera and then go away from it and somebody will come and put something away. And so there were challenges about race but he said he got along with everybody. He wasn't particularly racially identified. He took one African-American class, but then he went to orientation, but he said he had friends with everybody. So it's not that race wasn't unimportant, it was, but we don't have a language for class in America. And I think that we need to look more closely at how class makes a difference, particularly in interactions with institutions, in preventing problems, and then just thinking more about social class as we think about family life, because about half of jobs come from informal networks. They're not generally advertised. So social networks really matter. Increasingly, marital choice is segregated by social class. People tend to marry people only who have a college degree. Increasingly, where people live is segregated by social class. And so we have to, I think, understand more deeply a language about inequality connected to education and employment. And if we do that, then I think we'll help to fill out our understanding of where we are in America today and the problems that we face in the future. Thank you. We have time for questions. In the middle-class families, the fathers were present. In the working-class families, some of the fathers were present. In the poor families, it was hard. By definition, to be poor, you had to be below the poverty level. And some of the fathers were present but not living with them. They weren't co-residential. So it was confounded, as it is in America. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, Garrett Tallinger was white and Stacy Marshall was black. What were the main differences between the families? Stacy had one sister who was older. Garrett was the oldest child, and they had 2 younger brothers. They were both families that placed a lot of emphasis on being athletes. And so I was extremely surprised that both, Stacy also got a college scholarship for basketball, which made me anxious because I thought, did I have a really odd family, you know? But in fact, the Game of Life shows that, which is a study, shows that about a third, 31% of kids in liberal arts colleges have some kind of sports. So I think it's increasingly common. Mr. Tallinger, it's interesting, both the fathers had a sense of humor. Like the very first time I met Mr. Marshall, he looked at my resume. He looked at it and he said, "What?" He said, "We're so proud of you," you know. And there's other research has shown this as well, that fathers have a very important role in family life, but often they tell jokes, they lighten things up. You know, mothers are running around like crazy doing housework, making the planning, doing the mental work, and fathers generally aren't involved in that, but they're also very important in other ways. Garrett, they both didn't test well. So, you know, they lived in different states, they had different kinds of jobs. I thought they were similar in some ways. Both the kids had very acrimonious, very bitter fights with their siblings when they were younger. One time we were we went on a family outing with the Marshalls, and the girls were in the back, and they were yelling at each other and spitting on each other, and one of them had the head and was like pounding her head against the windshield, you know, and their parents were like, oh man. They said we should have separated them by putting one kid in the front and one kid in the back. And they didn't exactly love this, but this was like the deal. And similar in all the middle-class families, actually, this very bitter. And so as the kids aged, the kids said, well, we get along better now. And they had grown closer with their siblings than when they were 10. The working class and poor kids didn't have that kind of bitter, very bitter sibling acrimony. They had fights, they had spats, but it was more collective than individualistic.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's a complicated process. I think that I personally am impressed by the transformative aspect of a college degree. There's a book called Passing the Torch by Paul Attewell and David Lavin. And they follow young women who were actually in the CUNY system, and they also look at a large national representative data set. And they find these children, even these women who barely squeaked into college, like with a C- average in the open admission period, they find that it really changes their parenting to have a college degree. They reason with their children more, they are more likely to read to them, they limit TV watching, they attend parent-teacher conferences. Now, what is it about taking English and history and calculus that makes you change your parenting? I don't think we really understand. And then also the occupations of these people are very different, and they involve more reasoning and more skill development over time. So I do think the parents' own job situation really makes a difference. There's a book by Alfred Lubrano called Limbo, and he is a reporter actually at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he was upwardly mobile. And his father laid bricks, and he went to Columbia. And he describes being a reporter and having a problem with his boss. And his father was like raging. He said, they pay you nothing and they do it? He said, next time you do that, you throw them against the wall and show them who's boss, you know? And that was an occupational skill that was extremely helpful in his own occupation, but wouldn't have been very helpful in the managerial setting. And so, and some of these upwardly mobile working young people from working class families find the office, they say it's sort of phony, or people go along with a program they know will never work simply to get along, to go along to get along. While some of the working class people can't believe they're wasting money and telling them. So there's some occupational skills, I think, that might be playing a role as well. Yeah. Yeah, was there a difference in the average age? Absolutely. So, so for example, both Stacy, no, I got this wrong. Both Wendy Driver and Katie Brindle had babies. Katie Brindle, who was a white poor girl, had a planned pregnancy when she was 15. And the book Promises I Can Keep by Kathy Eden and Maria Kafalis show that that's pretty common. You know, 1/3 of babies born today are born to unmarried mothers. I asked the kids what they thought they'd be doing in 5 years. It was interesting, even like Harold McAllister said, well, yeah, but 5 years I have to be married and have kids. And the middle class kids will say, 5 years, that's too early to be married. Maybe I'll be traveling. So people had different ideas of when was an appropriate age to take on marriage and children. And their parents themselves were different. So I have been in communities where the mothers, highly educated mothers, you know, women with college degrees often have babies when they're 38, 40, you know, older. And they're the same age as grandmothers of the children who are from poor families. Yeah. What would be the interventions one could do on both, either? That's right, in terms of both on the parents on one hand or the institutions. I guess I'm of two minds on the issue of interventions. On the one hand, I do think, let's say if I met somebody who wanted to be upwardly mobile, I have ideas about what that person could do. On a global level, we live in a stratified society that's really almost like a pyramid. There are relatively few slots at Harvard or at Penn. What Penn accepts when around 15% of our students. There are relatively few good jobs in America. There are a lot of bad jobs in America. Most of the jobs that are being created are relatively low-wage jobs, often around a minimum wage, without benefits, without promotion opportunities. And so the availability of good jobs and opportunities in elite settings are by definition limited. So if you wanted to reduce inequality, say in Europe, Europe has much less inequality than we have. France, Germany, England even, Sweden, Norway. You'd have to look at a redistribution of resources to create that inequality. Like for example, we have a very high rate of infant mortality, one of the highest in the world. We have a very high rate of incarceration, one of the highest in the world. So the US is unusual in the sense we have much more inequality than many other countries in the world. On a more personal level, I think reading to children is something that is very helpful, but a lot of the advice just sort of drives me crazy because really they say, well, you should get a book. First of all, you have to know what kind of book to choose. And then you have to read to them and you ask them questions, they'll say. Well, this is completely consistent with a middle-class way of child-rearing where you're asking them questions. But if working-class parents are giving kids directives, you know, cut it out, shut up, don't do this, and the kids are on their own, this is not consistent with their child-rearing. So I think institutions would need to develop strategies that are more directive-based, drill-based, such as memorizing multiplication tables or drilling. And many middle-class teachers are averse to those kind of methods. They're a whole language approach. They're very averse to drilling. So I think you'd have to change teachers' approaches. And then my final point is the networks with kin groups are very powerful. And so cousins and aunts and uncles are very powerful networks. And I would look for policy interventions that build on those networks. The classroom-based program is much more suitable to middle-class parents who are enrolling their kids in all these activities and meeting other children and mothers in age-graded systems. So they have networks that are based around schools, while the networks for working-class parents, white and black, are more based around family. So I would try to think if there's a way to help cousins help other cousins or aunts or uncles. And I think that might be a more fruitful approach. Yes. I guess I have two thoughts about that. One is that there's clearly an immigrant advantage, and which fades over time. So children of first-generation students, first-generation immigrants do vastly better in school than, say, third generation. And so there's something distinctive about being an immigrant. I think it's similar to how do you become wealthy in America. The best way to be wealthy is to be born to wealthy parents, right? If you're born a child of Bill Gates or the Rockefellers, that's the best way to be, and that's the most common way to become wealthy. Are there other ways that you can become wealthy in America? Yes. And so I think the immigrant pathway is a different pathway. But I do know from other research, especially from Professor Zhao at UCLA, that there are signs that the immigrant communities band together and share knowledge, very similar to this. Like, for example, in the Chinese language newspaper, supposedly in New York, they have a lot of information about how do you get into the elite high schools. In UCLA and LA, some of the Chinese immigrants are entrepreneurs, and they have customers who are middle-class clients in restaurants and dry cleaning, and those parents will sometimes give them crucial pieces of information about how to manage. But I think that that is part of the story, but I think there's something else going on that doesn't explain the whole story that's connected to being an immigrant. Yes? I think it's easy to forget how hard it is to go through life when you have very, very scarce resources. So waiting for buses, the social system is pretty limited, so buses are pretty unreliable, it turns out. And you go to a laundromat and the machines are broken. You go to cash a check in a bank and you can't cash a check unless you have an account there. So if you are unbanked, if you don't have a bank account, which many of the poor families didn't, then getting money, all these things are challenging and exhausting in time. There are also higher levels of depression among mothers who are poor. So I think the time issue, now the middle class moms, of course, were incredibly squeezed for time, especially they were in the labor market full time. And of course, many of the jobs were more than full time. Most middle class jobs are more professional jobs. So they also had time squeezes as well, but they were more easily able to outsource some of the help. But they really couldn't outsource all the help. I mean, and there's a book called The Second Shift by Arlie Hochschild, and she describes a mother who was a lawyer who worked 35 hours a week, and she kept hiring these people. She hired somebody to cook, and then she hired someone to clean, and she hired someone to play ball with her son. And, oops, lost my voice. And she couldn't outsource being a mother, essentially. Things would still fall through the cracks. And so there's a lot of mental work that goes on in coordinating all these institutions. And I have a paper with another colleague. And see, there's a lot of research that shows that housework is very stressful because mothers do work that is deadline-oriented, getting food on the table, getting kids in bed. Dads do work that is like mowing the lawn or taking the cars in, which is less deadline-oriented. But if you have dinner 15 minutes late, who notices? But if you pick up a kid 15 minutes late on a dark corner after a soccer game, you are in a lot of trouble. And so these organized activities create tremendous pressure on middle-class parents for time deadlines, which is a very different kind of time pressure that the poor families face. But there's this level of exhaustion in trying to make it through the day if you're poor that is, I think, and then of course the fruits and vegetables and the grocery stores and the food deserts. There are many different factors compounding the difficulty of making it through the day. I have my undergraduates at the University of Pennsylvania take a bus ride through Philadelphia, and it takes a long time. A bus stop every block, et cetera, and the stores are different, et cetera, like that. But just living the life of being poor, which I think would be helpful for middle class people to do, once a year for a few days, is very eye-opening in terms of the amount of labor it takes just to make daily life happen. So. Thank you very much for coming.